Hello and welcome to Lesson 4, Session 4 of Grammar Development with LFG and XLE. As we have been doing, I'll briefly recap what we did last time. Last time you should have learned about lexical rules. In particular, we looked at the passive and dative shift in English. We looked at different types of functional equations, defining, constraining, negative, and existential. We had examples for all of those, and you should now be comfortable with using those in your grammars as you're going along. And we talked about test suites and the importance of test suites. This time, Session 4, we will look at the LFG treatment of adjuncts so that you can start incorporating things like adjectives and adverbs into your grammar. That's that. We will also look at PPs because they also function as adjuncts, and that continues with some of the PP treatment that we had last time as well. And PPs are actually a fairly complex part of a language, and we will talk about oblique PPs, which we've seen in the passive and the dative shift examples, versus adjunct PPs and how to distinguish between those, and we'll do that for English. In particular, we'll talk about semantically heavy versus light prepositions, so prepositions or postpositions. Then, a completely different topic is tokenization, in particular sentence punctuation. I would like to show you, or I'm going to show you how to integrate that into your grammar so you can start using full stops and commas and exclamation marks, etc. And we'll start with that, in fact. So far we've parsed sentences, I'm sure you've noticed, that have not contained any punctuation. But of course this needs to be integrated into the grammar at some point, and we'll start doing it in this lesson. I don't mind not using punctuation, but over the times that I've taught this course, I've seen that people would like to start with the punctuation fairly early on, so they need to do that. Dealing with punctuation is part of the overall process of tokenization, which is a different natural language processing task. And tokenization deals with things like capitalization. You will also have noticed that I've always done things in lower caps. At the moment, if you're in your grammars, if you would like to have capitalized words, you need to enter those separately as separate lexical items into your lexicon. I have not bothered to do that right now. Right now we're just doing lower caps. And eventually, once you have a good-sized grammar, capitalization, whether things are written with a capital at the beginning of a sentence or not, they're dealt with as part of the tokenizer. As are things like multi-word items like San Francisco or New York, abbreviations like Mr., Ms., Doctor, Professor, Prof, etc. Tokenization in pargram grammars are generally implemented via finite state transducers. And these tokenizers interact with the finite state morphological analyzers so that you have a cascade of transducers eventually. It's the way it's set up with an XLE, it's already all there. You can do much more if you're doing a language of your own, and the documentation is fairly explicit about what you can and how you can parameterize everything. So I'll refer you to the documentation for that. In fact, creating good tokenizers is an art of its own. We're not going to have time to cover that in this course. I'm not going to cover it. The default tokenizers, which are provided with XLE, are fairly good. They've been built by various people, including Ron Kaplan. If you're working with a language of your own that is not based on an alphabet, a Latin alphabet, you will eventually have to build your own tokenizer. You will need to build your own tokenizer. But as part of this course, we will work with the default tokenizers provided by XLE. Okay, so let's see. There's also, I wanted to say something else here. There is quite a good description in other parts of elsewhere about how to do tokenizers. Jurafsky and Martin, the introductory book on natural language processing, has a discussion. There's a book by Ken Beasley and Lauri Kartunen on finite state morphological analyzers, which has a good discussion. The XLE documentation has a very good discussion. It's not part of this course, so I'm just telling you this here. You can go look this up yourself. Okay, so now we'll proceed on to arguments and adjuncts. So far we've parsed sentences that have consisted of a verbal head, a predicate, so a verb basically, which functions as the main predicate as the sentence, and NP arguments of that verbal head. That's not quite right. NP arguments and PP arguments of that verbal head. So we've seen the obl to in the dative shift, and we've seen the oblique agent in the passive, so by the dog or to the dog. We've seen things like that. Arguments have the property that each type may only appear once. That's a fundamental property of arguments. You can have only one subject per clause, so you can't say things like the dog appeared, or the dog, the gorilla appeared. You can't have things like that. You can't have two objects, etc. So the idea is that each argument can only appear once. Each type of argument can only appear once. This is quite different from what adjuncts can do. So if you look at sentences like the small, gray, intelligent dog devoured bones, or the dog devoured large, delicious, juicy bones, what we have here is we have adjectives, and you can have any number of adjectives. I've got 2 in the first sentence, 3 in the second sentence, but in fact I can have many, many, many times of adjectives. They can appear multiple times. They're all of the same type. These are attributive adjectives. They're the same type, and they can appear multiple times. In principle, they can appear infinitively many times. You can make a sentence with adjectives as you can keep going, keep talking until your breath gives out, until something else happens. But in principle, you can have infinitively many. In LFG, these adjectives are treated as adjuncts, and this is not special to LFG. Most theories of grammar will treat these as adjuncts. And there are other types of adjuncts, of course, beyond adjectives. Other types are adverbs, something like very, very, very large. So very, very, very are the adverbs, or absolutely, totally, those are the adverbs. And types of PPs. So we've seen argument PPs, I've said that. But that example there, the dog barked in the garden. In the garden is an example of an adjunct PP, because you could just say the dog barked. The sentence is perfectly fine. And in the garden, under the tree, on a rock are the same kind of prepositional phrase. They're spatial prepositional phrases. They're telling you where the dog was. So they're of the same type, and as you can see, there's several of them that can appear. We've got 3 here, but you could, again, like with adjectives, you could continue on and have many, many, infinitively many, okay? So far, we've treated PPs as oblique arguments, but as the example above shows, they can also be adjuncts. Obliques are governable grammatical functions, as opposed to adjuncts, which are not governable. So you can only have one type of an oblique, but you can have many different types of adjunct PPs. Okay, this is going to be a bit tricky to explain, but this is how prepositional phrases work. They are multifunctional. So the ones that you see here, the dog barked in the garden, that's an adjunct prepositional phrase. The gorilla gave a bone to the dog. The to the dog there is an oblique. It's part of what the sentence needs. It's part of what give needs. If you just say the gorilla gave a bone, that's a bad sentence in English, right? So to the dog is an argument of the sentence. It is not easy to tell the difference always. I will try to give you examples here. It is also a very language-specific thing. So what I'm telling you here works for English. If you're working on a different type of language, you will need to figure out the linguistic generalizations for that yourself. Okay, so if it weren't difficult enough that there's adjunct PPs versus oblique PPs, you actually have 2 different types of oblique PPs. Both types are characterized by the fact that the prepositional phrase is required. It's an argument, okay? But in one type, you have a generally spatial meaning, which looks a lot like the adjunct PPs we've seen. So if you look at the example, the gorilla put the banana in the tree, it looks a lot like the gorilla gave a bone to the dog, right? No, so not that one. It looks a lot like the one we had, the dog barked in the garden. But in fact here, you cannot leave out the in the tree. You need some kind of PP argument there. So you can't say something like the gorilla put the banana. Okay, that's bad in English. The in the tree, that prepositional phrase is needed. It's an argument. It's telling you where he put the banana or where she put the banana, but it's an argument. In contrast, the dog barked in the garden, you can just say the dog barked. That's a good sentence. The in garden is absolutely optional, which is why it's analyzed as an adjunct. Okay, so the dog barked in the garden. The in the garden there is an adjunct. You can just say the dog barked. The gorilla put the banana in the tree. If you try to leave off in the tree, you get a bad sentence, like the gorilla put the banana. So in this case, in the tree is an argument. And in LFG, these are analyzed as oblique arguments. Okay, that's one type of oblique. In the other type, the preposition has no separate or only a very weak or light meaning. So far, in really means put something inside something, on really means put something on top of something. But if you look at the examples over here, where we're getting the meaning of somebody serving somebody else in the restaurant, so the maitre d' or the waiter waited on the customer, that doesn't mean that the maitre d' was sitting on the customer or sitting there waiting on him, right, or on her. What it means is that the maitre d' served the customer some food or some drinks or etc. So the on there doesn't really mean on. It means something. It's very hard to characterize what it means, but it doesn't have that spatial meaning of being on top of something. Okay. You can also only have one of these ons, so you can't say something like the maitre d' waited on the customer, on the boss. That's bad. And you cannot leave off the on, the customer. So if you just say the maitre d' waited, that does not mean served somebody. He didn't serve somebody. That just means he waited in some place. Okay, and where that place is, that's optional. Okay, so to recap, you have two different kinds of oblique argument PPs. In one, the preposition really means something. Okay, it's expressing usually some kind of spatial thing, where somebody did something, where somebody went, etc. In the other type, it looks exactly the same, but it doesn't have that meaning. It doesn't really mean on or in or under, etc. Okay, it's a hard type of thing to distinguish. You'll have to sit and think about each one of them and try to apply the criteria that I've given you here. It'll be part of your exercise, so you'll have to try to understand this. You can, of course, read other things as well, but do try to understand this. Okay, so how do we analyze this? Let's get on towards that. So we have various kinds of PPs. The PPs that function as adjuncts, the preposition expresses a meaning of its own. I've said that. Recall, any number of PPs can be used, and the verb does not require this as an argument. That's why they're analyzed as adjuncts. Here an example, spatial sense of on. Wait with on not in the sense of serving a customer, so the maitre d' waited on the bench on the bank of the river. On something else, you could keep going. You can have as many as you like. Okay, and these are really spatial things. So he wasn't serving, he was really waiting somewhere on the bench, which was on the bank of the river. And you can just use it without, okay? So that concludes that. How we analyze them, the adjunct PPs the adjuncts are assumed to have their own predicate value, their own pred. That's because they contribute their own semantics. And in many languages, they also impose things like case restrictions on their arguments. This makes prepositions look a lot like verbs in several respects. And so people have talked about prepositions being similar to verbs in some respects, similar to nouns in other respects. They're very, very interesting creatures, these prepositions. To illustrate the case requirement, just so you see what happens, I've given you an example from German here. In German, the prepositions require their objects to have a specific case. This is something you have to learn if you learn German. Some prepositions allow for more than one case. This is a very famous example in German. So if you have der Hund rannte in dem Garten, where the dem is an article and it's case marked with its dative, and you have the in, that means the dog ran around in the garden. So the dog was already in the garden, is running around in there. Versus der Hund rannte in den Garten, where you have an accusative. Den is the determiner, and it's marked for the accusative. Again, you have the preposition in. This one means the dog ran into the garden. So he was not in the garden, and then he ran into it. Okay? So it's a kind of directional meaning here. where he takes up a path that takes him into the garden. And this is expressed through this alternation between dative and accusative, and that happens for several prepositions. And it's specified by the prepositions what kinds of case marking they take and what kinds of meanings they result in. Okay, so they're like verbs in that way, which is why we treat them with an LFG. We treat them as having their own predicate value, their own semantic value, and also a subcategorization frame, like I've shown on the slide here. So for example, for on, we would say ups predicate is equal to on, and on subcategorizes for an object. Okay, and you can worry about why object and not why some other grammatical function. That has its own reasons that I cannot go into here now. But that's what's usually assumed, that prepositions subcategorize for an argument. This argument is usually assumed to be an object. And then you can place certain constraints on what type of argument that is. Here's an example. You will be asked to implement these various different types of PPs in the grammar as part of the exercise for this lesson. To help you do that, I've given you examples for each of the types. This is the example for the adjunct type. You can see there's main predicate sleep. It has a subject dog. We're used to that. What you also see here is an adjunct. Okay, and in that adjunct is placed the prepositional phrase. On is there. Okay, it's got its own predicate. And on subcategorizes for an object. You can see that there, bed, and it's got case accusative. I've put that in here for now. And what we've also put here is, you can see that here, p-type sem. This p-type attribute we've added in to mark whether something is a semantic, or so a semantic preposition, whether it has a lot of semantics associated or heavy semantics associated with it, or whether it's the other value is no sem, whether it's a light preposition like in the wait on a customer example. Okay. What you can also see is that so far we've had square brackets for everything. Here we have a curly bracket. I'll explain this in a bit, but what this curly bracket says is that this is part of a set. The curly brackets in the LFG in the F structure representations denote sets. The effect of that is that you can have more than one thing as a value for the adjunct. Okay, so these are feature valued sets, and you can have more than one thing in them. That's how that is solved, that you can have multiple instances of everything. You define them to be sets, and then you can have several elements in that set. Okay, let's look at the next thing. Obl PPs. So these are the non-semantic, the wait on type. The maitre d' was waiting on the customer types of Ps. In LFG, we assume that they do not have a pred. They're simply registered via p-form attribute. For example, ups p-form equals on. Okay, so, and we found this actually for grammar writing purposes, we found this quite useful to just register what kind of preposition it is that you had. It doesn't matter for checking well-formedness, but it's generally a good idea, we have found in our practice of grammar writing. If you have different types of prepositions or different types of forms of other kinds of lexical items, it's a good idea to just register them. And that's what we do within the pargram effort. We generally do that with a form attribute, in this case p-form, and we just say, okay, I found this preposition, it's on. In case somebody wants to know, we've registered that in this attribute. The semantic Ps, they're semantic Ps, semantic prepositions in these obliques, are assumed to have a pred, just like the adjunct PP we just saw. So for example, for put the banana in the tree, we have ups pred is equal to in, and in subcategorizes for an object. Okay, so it looks very similar to the adjunct one in this case. The difference is that there's no adjunct here, but that we have a three-place argument. So we have put, takes a subject, an object, and an oblique. This is just a general oblique. I haven't specified it in any way. And the oblique is not part of a set. It's got the square bracket, so there's only one of these things. And you have a pred on, and on subcategorizes for an object. And we've got p-type sem again. Okay, so the difference between what we have here and what we saw before, This part inside here looks pretty much the same. Okay, you have a preposition, a semantic preposition which subcategorizes for an object. The difference lies in how it's treated with regard to the verb. In this case, it's an argument of the verb. There can be only one of it. In the previous case, where is it? In the previous case, it's an adjunct inside these curly brackets, which means that there can be more of them. So we could also have on the bed, in the bedroom, inside the house, etc. We could have them all in here as well. Okay, now let's move back. So this is the semantic PP, the oblique prepositional phrase. And now we have, lastly, an example for a non-semantic prepositional phrase, which is also an obl. The difference here is that what we do is we don't assume that the preposition has its own predicate value, so you don't see a pred in here. All you have is the P form, on. We've registered it that. This is the example, the gorilla waited on the dog. So this would be as in the maitre d' waited on the customer. It's that meaning. So he's not actually sitting on the dog, he's actually giving him a bone or something. Okay, we have P-type no-sem. No extra object in here. It's a very flat structure. But we have the same as what we had before. Wait is a two-place predicate in this case, gorilla and dog, subject and oblique. Okay, so the on the dog is considered to be an argument of the preposition of the verb. Okay, so you have the slides, you have the examples, you can go through this again. It is a fairly confusing part of grammar, which is why I've given you the examples. I get confused as well every time I try to teach this, but I think I've gotten it right here, so we can continue on now. Okay, so dealing with adjuncts, let us return to how adjuncts are dealt with within LFG. I've already told you they're put into a set rather than just having just one value. And this is, okay, so let me start again. So recall that LFG allows only one value for a given attribute. That's what we've had so far. We've talked about feature unification, we've talked about consistency, etc. So if you had two different values for a given attribute, the unification would crash. But we've seen adjuncts can appear multiple times, infinitively many times in fact. So how can you deal with this? Well, what I've already said before, what I've shown you, is that the solution is that these elements are projected into set-valued attributes, such as adjunct, and we've also introduced things like mod for compounds. So we have several of these types of these set-valued attributes that you can define. You can see which ones you need. For now, we'll be working with adjunct. And the LFG notation of how to do that in the functional annotation is this. Down is an element of ups adjunct. Okay, so if you've got an adjunct, like an adjective or a prepositional phrase, what you do is you say this thing, this prepositional phrase, or this adjective, this is in fact an element, not equal, but an element of the ups adjunct set. Okay, and then you just keep adding more stuff into that set. Sets are defined to be able to have several elements in them. The corresponding XLE notation is, it reads exactly the same. Down is the element of the ups adjunct. It's just that the notation is different. It's an ASCII-friendly notation, if you recall. Okay, so we'll see that in the grammar in a little bit. In fact, we'll see it right now. So what I've got now is the demo that shows you what the grammar can do now. And I'll be demonstrating to you punctuation first, adjectives, and then the various types of PPs again. Not all of them, in fact, because you'll be asked to put some of them, add some of them in as part of the exercise. The grammar I'm using is called grammar3.lfg. You'll be able to download that. The test suite is test suite 3, and you'll be able to download that as well. Okay, and then we'll move on over to calling that up. Okay, so I'll call up, let's take all of this away. You can see Sina. Let's call up the grammar again, Emacs grammar 3.lfg. Okay, and let me make this bigger again. Okay, so as usual, I'll just go through this grammar a little bit and talk you through what you're seeing here. It has changed compared to what you've seen before. There's one change in the configuration file, which is this line. I've added a section, a morphology section, called it Demo English as well. And where is this morphology section? Well, it's down here. What does this morphology section do? What it does, it's adding in a tokenizer, okay? And it says P, this is the parsing direction, use the finite state transducer basic parse talk. And for G, that's the generation direction, use the default gen tokenizer, okay? You have to have different tokenizers for parsing versus generation because you might want to parse 3 spaces if somebody's typed in too many spaces by accident, but you don't want to generate those 3 spaces back out. So they're 2 different tokenizers. That's quite normal. Usually XLE is actually set up so that there is a default, if you don't specify anything in the morphology section up here, which I hadn't until now, then it'll go for a default tokenizer and it just automatically add that in. You don't even notice that it's there. That part doesn't seem to be working, at least on my machine. So what I've done here is I've put in the tokenizers explicitly. But on the whole, that's actually probably not a bad idea, so that you can see that there is a tokenizer in the background, running in the background, and that it's doing a certain amount of work. Okay, and this is how you would integrate it. You need to add a morphology section, and you need to say tokenize, etc. And you can read all about this in the morphology section in the XLE documentation. There's many, many more things you can do. For us, at the moment, this is what we need. Okay, so this is integrating the tokenizers so that we can now add punctuation. So if you look at this rule over here, the S rule, it has been expanded a little bit by this line over here. And what I've done is I've put in a new category. I've called it period. And this is for punctuation. And we can say, okay, what does period stand for? Well, in fact, let's jump to the bottom of the grammar, escape shift greater than. I've got a new entry in my lexicon. So we treat, the punctuations are treated as lexical items in a sense. And it's just the little full stop here called period. And we give it a morph code. And I've said nothing about it here. So it doesn't contribute any information, but it's dealt with, okay? It's dealt with in the lexicon. And you can add other things in here as well, commas, exclamation marks, etc. Okay? This period will, I'll start, I'll just show it to you. Okay, create parser grammar 3.lfg. Okay, so we've written it. So now I'll say parse the dog appeared with a period. Okay. And this is the analysis, which is correct. But if you look at what I actually typed in, I typed in appeared with a period at the end, right? So what the tokenizer has done, it's gone and split up the period, the full stop here, from a period. It's made them into 2 separate items. Okay, that's part of what the work of the tokenizers that it's been doing. And then my grammar could go in and recognize this as a separate item, took it out of its lexicon, said, oh, this period, and could integrate it in the tree. And the rest of the stuff works just as the way you've seen before. So we have a period verb, it has a subject, indicative past, okay? You could think about whether a period should add some other information, like it's a declarative statement. That's left up to you for now. Okay, so that's what the tokenizer does. The tokenizer splits off this full stop, this period, from the verb, and does that. If I take that out, if I take out that part of the morphology, let's just do that. and then we'll see what happens. So I'll comment out this bit. I'll comment out the fact that we've integrated a tokenizer. Then let's restart XLE. Oops. Let's make it one buffer. And reload the grammar. And then reparse. What happened? What happened is that it says, okay, I can find, it gives you a morphology chart. It says I can find the, I can find dog. The is a determiner, dog is a noun. But I have no idea what appeared followed by a full stop is. Okay, so it's parsing this as one item, appeared full stop. And we do not have appeared full stop in the lexicon. So it's saying, I have no idea what that is. Okay, so that's why this is not working. I could, if I change this example around, this is another way to fix punctuation, is you do the tokenization yourself. You add a white space in between, and you try to parse it again. That'll work. Okay? Because now it knows I did the tokenization for it. I typed in the white space myself over here, and now appeared and the full stop are different items. I've done the tokenization myself, and the grammar can figure it out. Okay? So, but we want to work with a tokenizer. We don't want to have to do our the tokenization ourselves. So I'll put the tokenizer back into the grammar, comment that back in, and then we'll keep working with that. Right, so let's look at the grammar some more. Okay, so the period here, the full stop, I've put it into brackets. I've made it optional. Why? Because well, you could make it obligatory, then every sentence has to end with a period. I've put it in optionally here because sometimes I forget to type it, and that just makes it a little bit more comfortable. Okay, let's look at the VP rule. The VP rule, I've complicated because it now accounts for ditransitives. That's what you did in the last exercise. I won't go through that. You should be able to understand that yourself. Because you did that. This is wrong. It should not be a secondary object. It should not be accusative. Oops. Now what am I doing? I have to put in a escape Q. Oh. Okay. So I just took out the case information because that was wrong. It shouldn't have accusative case as a secondary object. Okay, so I'll let you understand those yourselves because you should have implemented that pretty much similarly yourself. What I have added in, which is new, is this part. Okay, what does this part do? These other parts down here, they add in the specialized prepositional phrases, the obl to for the dative shift, the obl agent for the passive. This part up here, the preposition star, PP star, this is the cleany star. This one says have as many as you like or none. And it says put things into an adjunct. Okay, whatever this PP is, it's going to be part of the adjunct set. We only want semantic prepositions here. Okay, we have a constraining equation that says if you're going to be an adjunct, you need to be a constraining equation. You need to be a semantic preposition. But in fact, we have a disjunct here, right? So this is the first part of the disjunct. It says ups adjunct p type 7. This is the first part of the disjunct. So either this, or it can be an oblique. Okay, and we don't have a constraining equation here because remember, obliques can be either semantic prepositions. They can have either semantic prepositions or non-semantics. So we can have two types. For adjuncts, we can only have semantics, so we can constrain that. Okay, so PP star as many as you want, or 0. Two different options, either an adjunct with a semantic preposition or an oblique, and that can be either. Right, so now let's move on. Let's keep with a PP. The PP has been expanded. In your last grammar, you had a very, very simplified version. This is now a more complex version. We have two disjuncts again. We have two possibilities again. The first disjunct is here. The second disjunct is here. The first disjunct is for semantic prepositions. This could be obols or adjuncts. It says this needs to be constrained to be semantic. And the preposition, the NP that would follow the preposition will be the object of the preposition, and it'll have case accusative. Okay, so this is for adjuncts and semantic obols. The other option, the other disjunct, again has a prepositional. It's a P, it's going to be the head, just like above. But in this case, the P type is constrained to be no-sem, so a non-semantic type. Okay, and this is for the obols which don't have, where the preposition is not considered to have an object of its own. Okay, so we have three options here. We have adjunct, one, two options for oblique, one semantic, one non-semantic. That takes care of all of that. Right, so that's the prepositional phrase that's being called up from here. Now, this is the NP rule. I've added a little bit to the NP rule as well. I've added an adjective, a, again with a star, Kleene star, because we can have 0 or infinitely many. And again, it's annotated. It says whatever is in here, whichever adjective is here, put it into the adjunct set of the noun phrase. Okay? So we've done that. And let's see the lexicon. I've got some prepositions here. By is non-semantic. This was for by. This is for passives. These still need to be more complicated eventually, because most of these prepositions can be either semantic or non-semantic. What we've got here for on. So on, this is the semantic version in the first disjunct, the non-semantic version in the second disjunct. And most of these prepositions, most of the prepositions in English actually have both of these options. For by and to, I've just kept the non-semantic option that we had before. Okay. We've also added in some auxiliaries, not auxiliaries, adjectives, small, smart, gray. And for them, I just say pred small, pred smart, pred gray. And if you remember what pred does, if you don't remember, we can go up here under LFG and look under Rules, Templates, Lexicons. Click on that and say, show me what the template is for pred. And it'll jump to that right here. So all the template for pred says is, say, ups pred is whatever you gave me. Okay, so we're not saying very much about adjectives. You could say a lot more. Right now, I've kept it very simple. This is all we're doing. Let's have a look at what the adjectives would look like. So we've got the dog appeared. We can also do, let's do, which ones do we have? The small gray, the small dog appeared. Let's use punctuation because we can now. I have to restart the grammar because I took out the morphology section and I put it back in, but I didn't reload the the re-improved grammar. Okay, now let's try that again. Okay, now it works. So we have the small dog appeared. Here we have an NP with an adjective in it. And if we look at the F structure, we have the subject. And inside the subject is an adjunct, which says pred small. Okay, so remember we said this thing should be added into the adjunct set of the mother. Okay, the mother is dog, and it's been added into that adjunct set. So everything is as it should be. Let's try adding in another one, another adjective, the small gray dog, and one should use a comma, but the grammar doesn't contain commas yet, so I can't do that. You can do that as part of the exercise. The small gray dog appeared. That works as well. And let's look at the F structure. So at the C structure, we have two adjectives now following each other. And at the F structure, we have small and gray in an adjunct set. Okay, so we have an adjunct curly brackets set, and there's 2 values in it. Okay, small and gray. And we can have many, many more. So the other one we had in here was smart. I can add that in as well. Smart. And that works as well. Now we have 3 things in our adjunct set, and we can invent more adjectives, add them to our grammar, and keep going. Okay, so that's the adjectives. Now let me check what I was going to show you. What else? Make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Look at my test suite where I tried out things and made sure they worked so that I would remember what worked and what didn't. So we have done punctuation, that works. We have done adjectives, those all worked. Okay, now let's look at the PPs, that's the last thing. The gorilla waited, let's start with actually the dog slept on the bed. So we can start with that. So we have the dog, VP, that has a PP in it. And it could be anything, this PP, as we know. Let's look at it here. What is actually in it? Well, what's in it is a predicate, a main predicate with a subject in it, and then an adjunct set, which has in it pred, a predicate, on, the preposition is being the head of this predicate, and it's subcategorizing for an object, and that object is bed. Okay, so we have all that information there. So this is an adjunct. So the dog slept on the bed. It's being analyzed as an adjunct. We can think about, is this the correct analysis? Can we say just the dog slept? Yeah, that works. Can we also add more things in? The dog slept on the bed. And what else have we got? I have to think about what my lexicon contains. On the gorilla. So the dog slept on the bed on the gorilla. Maybe a very strange situation, but that doesn't work. So let me parse it again. The dog slept on the bed on the gorilla. Okay. As you can see, you can, for the parse command, you can use either curly brackets to put your sentence in, or you can use the double quotes. I find the double quotes easier to type, so I usually use them, but the curly brackets are actually better to use. But you can use either. Okay, so here is that analysis. Come on. Okay, there's the F structure. Let's put them underneath one another again. So for the C structure, we have 2 PPs now, on the bed, on the gorilla. And this corresponds to the F structure down here, where we have sleep. We just have one argument again, and we have the adjunct set. And now there's 2 things in this adjunct set. On the bed, P type sem. On the gorilla, P type sem. Okay? So many, many adjuncts, and we can keep going with more and more. I'll do another one on the gorilla. What do we have? These examples are going to get sillier and sillier. On the bone. So now we have 3 PPs. Okay, we can keep going, but I'll stop with 3. And we have 3 things in the adjunct set. We should, here, 1, 2, 3. So on the bone is over here. Okay, so that's working fairly well. And we can keep adding more things to the adjunct set, more and more and more and more. Okay, now let's look at the gorilla waited on the dog. What happens here? So we have 2 valid trees for this sentence. Okay, that's interesting. Let's see what those 2 trees are. First, let's look at this one. The gorilla waited on the dog. Okay, Let's see what the F structure for that is. There's actually two valid F structures. One is the gorilla waited on the dog, and this is an analysis in which it's an oblique with a semantic preposition that subcharacterizes for an object. So this is the reading in which, this is actually a reading that doesn't really exist, because it assumes that on the dog, it's an actual on, it's being on something, sitting on something, and the gorilla is waiting on that. So it's assuming that this is an argument of weight, and that actually doesn't work in that sense. So we're over-generating a little bit. Okay, let's look at the next structure. This is an adjunct, so we still have a semantic argument, and we have, now this is a sense in which the gorilla is just waiting, and where he's waiting is on the dog. So this is the sense in which he's actually sitting on the dog waiting, or standing on the dog waiting. A nonsensical meaning again, but it's there. And in principle, you could imagine a situation, strange child situation in a children's book, for example, or in a fairy tale. This could actually happen. Okay, so we've got that reading. So we've got two readings so far. Now let's look at the next tree. Well, it looks exactly like the tree we had before, but it's actually put together the prepositional and the noun phrase in a different way. How has it put it together in a different way? Well, it's got a non-semantic preposition with dog, with on, not subcategorizing for anything. And this is the reading where the gorilla is waiting on the dog in the sense of the maitre d' is waiting on a customer, where he's doing something nice to the dog, giving him some food, etc. Something like that, okay? So this is a reading we actually want. Why were there two different trees? Okay, these trees, it says two valid trees. This tree looks exactly like the same as the previous tree. But in fact, if you remember what the grammar was doing, there's two different trees that we do generate. So if you look at the PP rule, there's this version. That's the version we saw which had two F structures, one with an object inside an obel and one with an object inside the adjunct. That was the first tree. And this is the second tree, the one that we're looking at right now, where the P type is no sem and where it's just an oblique and the preposition has no argument, okay? So it has two different trees because in the first tree was put together by this rule with a semantic preposition, and the second tree was put together by this rule with a non-semantic preposition. Okay, and this tree gave rise to two different F structures. Let's look at that one again. Next tree, sorry. This was the first tree, right? First tree. It gave rise to two different F structures. So this is tree 1. You can see that here, CS1, C structure 1, gives rise to two valid F structures. This is F structure 1. One was the oblique with a predicate and the object. And the next one is the adjunct version. Okay, and these two versions are generated by this part of the rule. By this part of the rule together with the rule above, where you can say we can have an adjunct or an oblique. Adjunct or oblique, and those both can be semantic with this thing in here, okay? So quite a complex thing. PPs get even more complex. You'll do this in your exercise, because PPs can also modify noun phrases, and then you get the famous cases of PP ambiguity attachment, okay, and we'll see those in some way. The major point with PPs is that you get a lot of ambiguity with them. The ambiguity explodes exponentially, and what we'll do in the next lesson is we'll figure out how we can constrain some of this ambiguity. We already saw a little bit of ambiguity here. When you take this grammar and expand it even more, you'll have even more ambiguity for each for each sentence with a prepositional phrase that you'll pass. You'll have quite a lot of ambiguity. And then in the next session, we'll try to understand how to reduce some of that ambiguity, and we'll be using OT marks to do that. Right, now let's go back to my test suite. No, hit the wrong thing. That was it that I needed to show you. What I will show you is the entry for weight. We haven't looked at that. So this is the lexicon now for this grammar. What it has done, it's been very good about changing all the lexical entries to be encoded in terms of templates. You should have done that too as part of the last exercise. Okay, you could have made different design decisions. That's up to you. There's no right way to do things. There's elegant way to do things and less elegant way to do things. So your solution could look different from this solution. That's all right. But it's a lot cleaner. Everything's using templates. And we've added in this entry for weight, weighted. Weighted says it can either be intransitive or it can be an oblique. This is the weighted on the customer reading. Okay, so it's giving you both. There it can have an adjunct as a PP, and here it's giving the weighted on reading. Okay, and one thing we haven't done, this is a new template that has been introduced. So let's look at that. Let's go find that. Rules, templates, what was it called? Intrans obl here. Okay, here we are. We haven't actually said that this obl needs to be no-sem, so that's something one could add, and then one of those readings would go away. Okay, but we'll leave that for an exercise. So let's go back to the slides. And put this back up. Okay, we've looked at punctuation in the grammar. We've looked at adjectives and various types of PPs. We've come to appreciate that this is a fairly complex part of grammar that needs complex rules to deal with them. And we've actually now finished with lesson 4. The practical work you should do now is detailed in exercise 4 again, and you will practice with adjectives and adverbs, just integrating more adjuncts into the grammar. Various different types of PPs. You will be asked to expand the grammar to take even more PPs into account, in particular PPs modifying noun phrases. And you will be asked to do a little bit more with punctuation, so integrate a comma, etc. Okay, and that concludes this lesson. See you next time.